Hello everyone, today we are going to explain the content on negotiation of dispute prevention and handling clauses, Section 3, Force Majeure Clause. This section primarily focuses on understanding the meaning of force majeure, the identification of force majeure, and the force majeure clause in sales contracts. First, let's look at the meaning of force majeure. Force majeure, also known as irresistible force, refers to an event that occurs after the signing of a contract, not due to the fault or negligence of the parties to the contract, but as a result of an unforeseen, unpreventable, unavoidable, and uncontrollable accident which makes it impossible to fulfill or to fulfill on time the obligations under the contract. The party affected by the accident can be exempted from the responsibility of fulfilling the contract or can delay the fulfillment of the contract. Force majeure is a clause of exemption. The unpredictability and randomness of force majeure events determine that it is impossible for people to list all its manifestations and it is impossible to exhaust the various random events that could occur in the human world and nature. Therefore, although countries around the world all recognize that force majeure can exempt liability, but there is no country can accurately define the scope of force majeure, and due to different customs and legal consciousness, countries have different understandings of the scope of force majeure. The scope of force majeure events is primarily composed of two parts. First, events caused by natural forces such as floods, droughts, frost, snowstorms, lightning, fires, storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc. Second, events caused by political or social reasons such as government decrees, policy adjustments, strikes, riots, civil commotion, wars, etc. For the identification of force majeure events, internationally it is generally required that a force majeure event must meet the following three conditions simultaneously. First, the event must have occurred after relevant trade contracts were signed. If the event already existed at the time of signing the contract, the parties involved should have considered the impact of the event on the contract. Such an event does not possess the characteristics of randomness and suddenness, and therefore does not qualify as a force majeure event. Second, the event is not caused by the negligence or intentional actions of any party involved. In other words, the parties have no responsibility for the occurrence of the accident. Third, the occurrence of the event and its resulting consequences are unforeseeable, uncontrollable, unavoidable, and insurmountable by the parties involved. That is, the event was unforeseeable at the time of the contract was established, and its occurrence after the contract is purely accidental. Next, let's take a look at the force majeure clause in sales contracts. In international trade, when the buyer and the seller negotiate a transaction, force majeure events that may arise due to natural forces or social reasons after the deal is made, they cannot foresee or control. Additionally, there is no uniform interpretation of force majeure events and their legal consequences on an international level to avoid unnecessary disputes due to the occurrence of force majeure events and to prevent parties from arbitrarily expanding or narrowing the scope of force majeure events, shifting the responsibility they should bear, or creating additional issues. The buyer and the seller should clearly and specifically define the force majeure clause when making the contract to facilitate the performance of the contract. The force majeure clause typically includes the following. First, the scope of force majeure events, generally the practice of considering natural phenomena, wars, and severe disturbances as force majeure events is consistent across various countries. However, disputes often arise regarding the inclusion of other human-induced obstacles such as government intervention, failure to issue permits, strikes, government bans, embargoes, and government actions as force majeure events. Therefore, it is important for the buyer and the seller to reasonably define the scope of force majeure events in the contract. Second, legal consequences of force majeure events. According to relevant legal principles and international customs, the legal consequences of force majeure events generally take two forms. One is the termination of the contract, and the other is the modification of the contract. Third, notification period and method after the occurrence of an event. Upon the occurrence of a force majeure event, if it affects the performance of a contract, the party unable to fulfill their obligations in accordance with the agreed upon notification period and method should promptly notify the other party about the force majeure event and the impact it has on contract performance. Upon receiving the notification, the other party should promptly respond. And if there are any objections, they should also raise them in a timely manner. Next, let's look at what should be taken into account when invoking the force majeure clause. First, when defining the scope of force majeure events, it should be as specific and clear as possible, while also maintaining a certain degree of flexibility. Do not include content that is not permitted by national policies within the scope of force majeure events. Be cautious of foreign merchants who, when faced with situations that are unfavorable to their performance, make attempt to expand the scope to shift responsibility and avoid including ambiguous phrases in the force majeure clause. For example, phrases such as force majeure clause according to customary practice or generally recognized reasons for force majeure are vague and ambiguous, which can easily be misinterpreted and exploited by the other party, leading to unnecessary complications. Therefore, they should be avoided. Second, once a force majeure event occurs for any party according to the agreed upon time frame and method, they should immediately notify the other party of the event's details. Additionally, they must include the proposed course of action in the notification. If the failure to timely notify causes harm to the other party, they should bear their responsibility for compensation. Furthermore, a certificate must be provided by the designated certification authority as stipulated in the contract. Third, upon receiving the notification and the certificate of a force majeure event from the other party, one should promptly review and respond with their opinion to the other party based on the stipulated procedures without delay or neglect. Fourth, according to the contract provision, strictly review the other party's claim for exemption to determine whether the content they cite falls within the scope of the force majeure clause and to prevent them from arbitrarily expanding or narrowing the scope of force majeure when invoking it. Anything that does not fall within the scope of force majeure and where there is no provision for other events of human force majeure agreed upon by both parties cannot be treated as a force majeure event. Even if such a provision exists, it should be subject to negotiation between the parties. And if one party disagrees, it cannot be considered a force majeure event. Fifth, after the establishment of a force majeure event, determine the consequences of force majeure in a practical and realistic manner, adhering to the spirit of practicality, clarify the situation, determine the extent of the impact on contract performance, and use this assessment to decide whether to terminate the contract or to modify it. Please complete the following post-class tasks. Alright, this concludes today's lesson. See you in the next class.